What saturation do you use whilst mixing? Now, I'm not a massive fan of saturation whilst mixing. I like applying it over the master, but not necessarily in the mix. When working in the master, we use the Vertigo VSM2 and the Whitestone P331. I will use them when analog mastering, but I won't use saturation mastering when I'm digitally mastering. And the reason for that is quite simply that digital mastering compared to analog mastering, when you're using analog equipment versus digital equipment, when it comes to saturation, saturation is one thing that you just cannot compare when it comes to digital versus analog. Analog sounds a million times better. It really does sound brilliant. I mean, it's a case of analog glows and warms and does all these things that you describe, this kind of warming kind of effect. Saturation applies that in the master with analog equipment. With digital, it's a little bit, it feels a little bit stale and a little bit brittle, and not all the nice words, all these nice words that you use to describe saturation, that all comes from the analog equipment. So I'm not a massive fan of using it when mixing in the box. If I do use saturation, I use something very subtle. I will use something along the lines of the SSL saturation, the transformer plugin. I will use that because it is a very subtle sort of saturation. I will sometimes put the Vertigo VSM2 in, only because I know it so well from mastering. I'll use that, but I always know there's a massive difference between what I'm achieving using it in the mastering studio in comparison to using it in the box. I know there's that big difference. So I don't use it in the same way. I use it sort of, I wouldn't even say I use it as something that makes a song kind of glow or a certain sound glow. It's more used to kind of give it a bit more bite and a bit more grit. That's the only time I really will use saturation. I'm not a huge fan of the kind of saturation that distorts and kind of gives that sort of distorted sound. I'd much rather use something very subtle, and I'm personally, for me, I achieve that sort of warm sound different ways. I don't like to make something saturated in a mix, especially when it's on the verge of distorting a mix and causing kind of unwanted distortion that I don't want to add in the mix. I'm more happy to apply that over the master just because I use it in analog. I get a warm tone using it, but you don't quite achieve that in mastering. So to answer the question of what saturation do I use when mixing, I very rarely use saturation, and if I do use saturation, I use something very subtle, something like the SSL transformer.